In the summer of 1983, a tragedy occurred off the coast of Kamchatka that was not spoken about openly for a long time. The nuclear submarine K-429 sank. There were 120 people on board at the time: officers, midshipmen, and sailors. They all fought for their lives in complete darkness, with a lack of oxygen and icy water flooding the compartments. Despite the crew's desperate efforts, not everyone survived. Subsequently, the investigation blamed the submarine commander and chief engineer for the disaster. However, the debate continues to this day. Was this verdict fair, or were the commanders made scapegoats in a system where everyone was afraid to admit their mistakes? This event became one of the most tragic pages in the history of the Soviet submarine fleet during the Cold War, a period when the USSR and the US were engaged in a fierce, albeit unofficial, struggle for global influence. Nuclear arsenals, strategic aviation, and, of course, the submarine fleet played a key role in the balance of power between the superpowers. Submarines were not only a means of delivering a missile strike, but also an instrument of covert pressure. They could not be tracked and could appear anywhere in the ocean, ready to launch a preemptive strike. K-429 belonged to Project 670, codenamed SCAT. The submarine was launched in 1972 and belonged to the second generation of Soviet nuclear submarines. Compared to the previous generation, it had a number of significant improvements: improved hydroacoustic characteristics, lower noise levels, increased automation, and improved conditions for the crew. A total of 11 submarines were built under Project 670. The main task of the boats in this series was to combat the aircraft carrier strike groups of a potential enemy. To this end, K-429 was armed with a powerful set of weapons: torpedoes and 8 submarine-launched cruise missiles designed to engage large naval targets from long range. However, like many Soviet submarines, K-429 had a difficult service life. In its first years of operation, the submarine had 2 serious accidents. In one case, the reactor compartment was partially flooded, a situation that could have led to a radiation disaster. In another case, during the venting of the ballast tanks, the hull was damaged due to a sharp pressure surge. After repairs, the K-429 nuclear submarine successfully carried out combat patrol tasks. It stood the test of time and the seas, operating in the cold and stormy waters of the North Atlantic as well as in the ship traffic-heavy depths of the Mediterranean Sea. Later, K-429 made a long transition from the Northern Fleet to the Pacific Fleet, where it was included in the 10th Division of the 2nd Submarine Flotilla, based in Kamchatka. This was not an easy reorientation, as the Pacific Ocean placed completely different demands on equipment and personnel, and the submarine had to prove itself in the new conditions. In May 1983, after completing a 6-month autonomous voyage, K-429 finally returned to base and underwent scheduled dock repairs. However, despite obvious technical limitations, the boat continued to be listed as on combat duty, a strange but not uncommon practice at the time, when paper reports did not always correspond to the real situation. In June, everything changed dramatically. The Chief of Staff of the flotilla, Rear Admiral Oleg Arefiev, unexpectedly signed an order for unscheduled exercises. The exercises were urgent, almost frantic in nature, and were handed down from above as an indisputable requirement. The commander of the 10th Division, Vice Admiral Nikolai Alkiv, summoned Captain First Rank Nikolai Suvorov, an experienced submariner who was respected among his colleagues, and ordered him to take command of K-429 to go out to sea for just 1 day to conduct training torpedo firing. It would seem that the task was not difficult, just 1 day, without any combat threat. But Suvorov had good reasons to refuse. First, half of his permanent crew had already left on vacation after a long autonomous voyage. Second, the boat itself was undergoing repairs. Some of the equipment had been disconnected or dismantled. Taking the submarine out to sea under such conditions was irresponsible, to say the least. Suvorov tried to convey this to the command, explaining the situation, but Alkiv reacted to his words with irritation and even threatened him with a court-martial for insubordination. Suvorov found himself in a trap. It was a moment of difficult moral choice. Suvorov himself was already awaiting transfer to St. Petersburg, where a position as a teacher in officer classes awaited him. The transfer documents had already been approved and were in the process of being sent. His family, his wife and daughter, had already begun packing their belongings. Refusal to obey orders threatened not only administrative consequences, but also the disruption of their transfer, the end of their careers, and possibly the collapse of their entire family prospects. Faced with a hopeless situation, Suvorov reluctantly agreed. The hasty assembly of the crew began. People were literally pulled out of other submarines, and sailors and officers from 5 different crews were recruited. With no time for coordination, briefing, or testing of knowledge, the officers quickly assigned the new crew members to their combat posts. On that ill-fated day, there were 120 people on board the K-429 nuclear submarine. Captain Nikolai Suvorov was seeing more than half of them for the first time in his life. Many had been hastily assembled, pulled out of vacation or transferred from other submarines in order to somehow complete the crew. With limited time and without proper crew training, the captain simply did not have the opportunity to check the level of training of each sailor. This had a particularly critical impact on the distribution of duties at combat stations. For example, one of the key positions, the control panel for the diving and surfacing system, was assigned to a midshipman who had never worked with this system in practice before. In essence, this was a person without the necessary experience who was entrusted with the fate of the entire submarine. According to the combat training course, going to sea with an incomplete and uncoordinated crew that had not undergone the necessary training was strictly prohibited. But pressure from above, from the flotilla command, proved stronger than all the rules. The boat went to sea despite the gross violations. Among other violations was a critically important formality that could not be overlooked in conditions of real risk. The captain's signature confirming the ship's readiness was missing from the logbook. This effectively meant that K-429 was not officially considered seaworthy. The mandatory hull integrity check, a standard procedure that would have revealed any potential problems, including critical ones, during normal preparation, was also not performed. But now it was too late. On the evening of June 24, 1983, K-429 left the harbor and headed out to sea. Before commencing exercises in depths of up to 2,000 meters, Captain Suvorov decided to perform a trim check, a standard technical procedure necessary to level the boat's roll and trim. This is achieved by carefully filling the ballast tanks with water to stabilize the vessel's position in the water. A safer location was chosen for this, Serenea Bay, where the depth was about 40 meters. Closer to midnight, K-429 arrived at the designated point and began the procedure. They began to fill the ballast tanks with water. According to the instruments, the depth did not change, it remained at 0. This misled the officers, including the captain. Assuming that the boat was not sinking, they continued to fill the tanks. However, in reality, K-429 had already begun to slowly sink. At some point, the hull of the boat suddenly lurched from a slight impact. Then the submariners realized that the submarine had touched the bottom. Only later would it become known that the main depth gauge in the central post was simply not working, which meant that the entire procedure was being carried out literally blind. The boat was already lying on the bottom when an alarming message came in to the central post. Water was entering the 4th compartment. In accordance with the ship's survivability regulations, the crew of the 4th compartment immediately sealed the bulkheads to localize the accident and attempted to eliminate the source of the water ingress. However, they were confronted with the unprecedented power of the elements. Cold seawater was rushing into the submarine through the ventilation system, through 2 pipes, each 40 centimeters in diameter. The automatic shut-off mechanisms failed, and it was impossible to close them manually. The water pressure was tremendous, and in a matter of seconds, the compartment was filled to capacity. The entire crew in the 4th compartment fought to the last, but the water was relentless. In less than 3 minutes, the room was completely flooded. 14 people died. They remained at their battle stations. Next, seawater began to rapidly fill the 5th compartment, the reactor compartment. Fortunately, there were no people there, as they had been evacuated, and the reactor had been shut down by that point. But now the water literally divided the submarine into 2 separate parts. 83 people, including Captain Nikolai Suvorov, were trapped in the bow, and 23 sailors were trapped in the stern. Communication between them was impossible. An attempt was immediately made to resurface. Compressed air was pumped into the ballast tanks, hoping that its pressure would displace the water and allow the boat to float. But hopes were dashed. The air hissed away into thin air, literally going overboard. The buoyancy system did not work. Soon the lights went out. An ominous silence fell, broken only by the occasional rustling of instruments and the heavy breathing of people. The emergency lighting came on. Everyone understood that the boat would not be able to rise on its own. Meanwhile, a new emergency occurred in the third compartment. A battery that had come into contact with leaking seawater exploded. The room was instantly filled with acrid hydrogen sulfide smoke. The sailors who were there, suffocating, rushed into the neighboring second compartment. People were exhausted, many were beginning to lose their composure, but the crew held on, out of army habit, waiting for orders and not panicking. And yet the situation was becoming increasingly hopeless. A check of the emergency rescue equipment brought another heavy disappointment. The two emergency buoys, which were supposed to float to the surface and mark the crash site, remained in place. They simply did not work. The same thing happened with the floating rescue module, the only chance for immediate evacuation. It was faulty. The sailors could now only hope that someone on the surface would start looking for them. There was only one source of hope. According to the last radio report, the boat had been submerged for only an hour, and if the command's calculations were correct, a rescue operation would begin shortly. The reality turned out to be much worse than even the most pessimistic expectations. No one was looking for the sunken submarine. No distress signal was received on shore, and no ship set out for the presumed accident site. K-429, lying at the bottom in complete isolation, seemed to have disappeared from the radar not only literally but also metaphorically. For the flotilla command, it was as if it did not exist. More than 8 hours had passed since the tragedy. In conditions of complete uncertainty and no hope of rescue, Captain Nikolai Suvorov made a desperate but only correct decision: to send people for help. The choice fell on the two most enduring, strong, and experienced midshipmen, Nikolai Merzlikin and Mikhail Lesnik. They donned heavy rescue suits, took breathing apparatus with them, and made their way to the torpedo apparatus. There, clutching notes from the commander with the exact coordinates of the boat and information about the condition of the crew, they literally squeezed their way out through a narrow metal cylinder leading into the icy, black water. Once on the surface, they saw nothing but emptiness. All around them were waves and a gloomy sky. Without losing hope, the midshipmen spent almost 3 hours in the water until they were finally spotted by a Soviet warship passing nearby. The officers on board initially mistook the two exhausted men in strange gear for foreign saboteurs. Their story seemed so absurd and unbelievable. But after checking their notes and making several radio calls, everything fell into place. A sunken submarine lay at the bottom, dozens of people were trapped inside, and the countdown began, literally by the hour. An emergency alarm was immediately sounded. Ships and rescue services began to converge on the presumed site of the disaster. Upon arriving at the crash site, divers and rescuers set to work. A special hydrophone was lowered into the water, through which commands could be given and communication established. Responses from the submarine came in the form of dull blows of a metal sledgehammer on the hull. This was the only way to confirm that there were still survivors in the compartment. An attempt was made to use a rescue bell, which was supposed to dock with the emergency hatch and gradually pull people to the surface. However, the strong list and tilt of the boat on the bottom prevented a proper docking. It was decided to resort to a backup plan, to bring out the submariners 4 at a time through the same torpedo tube that the midshipmen had used to escape. The painstaking preparation for the evacuation began. During the inspection, it was discovered that there were not enough breathing apparatus for everyone, and the oxygen level in the available cylinders was much lower than normal. Urgent supplies were needed from the surface. Divers delivered the missing kits, risking their lives in conditions of low visibility and strong currents. As if that weren't enough, another accident occurred on the second day. A powerful explosion of storage batteries occurred in the first compartment, and the compartments were again filled with suffocating smoke, which made breathing difficult, caused coughing, watery eyes, and panic. Finally, after long hours of preparation and waiting, the most dangerous and tense part of the rescue operation began: the gradual exit of the submariners through the torpedo tube. The sailors took turns crawling into the narrow tube, which was normally used to launch torpedoes. It was so cramped inside that a person had to literally push themselves forward, with almost no room to turn around. After the valve was hermetically sealed, the tube filled with water, equalizing the internal and external pressure. Only then could the hatch on the outside be opened, and the fully equipped diver had to crawl out and climb to the surface using a buoy rope, a cable connecting the boat to a buoy. Rescuers were already waiting for them there. The procedure was dangerous, physically exhausting, and psychologically difficult. A mistake in breathing, equipment failure, panic, or simply hypothermia could cost a life. Unfortunately, not everyone was lucky. One sailor, while in the torpedo tube, died before reaching the surface. His equipment failed him. The second, having risen almost to the surface, became entangled in the buoy rope, got stuck underwater, and died of hypothermia and suffocation. The situation in the stern of the submarine was even more complicated. There were no torpedo tubes there, and the only way out was through the emergency escape hatch in the 7th compartment. There was only one person who was sufficiently qualified to use it safely in real conditions: Ensign Vasily Baev, who had previously served as a diving instructor. His knowledge and composure proved decisive. He personally helped 22 sailors leave the sunken submarine through this hatch, instructing and escorting each one in turn. Baev was the last to leave the stern, and he managed to keep the 7th compartment airtight, which greatly facilitated the subsequent operation to raise the submarine. For his actions, he was promoted and awarded the Order of the Red Star, deservedly so, because the lives of 24 people depended on him. The rescue operation lasted almost 4 days. All this time, the people were in a confined space under pressure, in darkness, dampness, and cold, at the limit of their physical and moral strength. Nevertheless, this rescue went down in history. 104 people were brought out alive from the sunken submarine, which was lying at a depth of about 40 meters. This was an unprecedented case in world submarine practice. A total of 16 people died, a tragic but, under the circumstances, minimal price. Commander Nikolai Suvorov was one of the last to leave. He carefully hid the differential logbook under his diving suit, a document that recorded the actions of the crew and the technical condition of the submarine. He hoped that this logbook would help establish an objective picture of events and serve as proof of his efforts to save people. However, a blow awaited him on the surface. Suvorov's logbook was confiscated, and he was immediately presented with a ship readiness log and other backdated documents to sign, which were intended to cover up those who had given the order to send the faulty ship out to sea. Signing the documents in a state of extreme stress and exhaustion, Suvorov essentially signed his own death warrant. The investigation into the sinking of K-429 lasted a year and a half. The main focus of the investigation and trial was deliberately concentrated exclusively on the period of time from the moment Captain Suvorov took command of the K-429 submarine to its sinking. Everything that preceded these events, including the illegal order to send the faulty ship out to sea, threats of court-martial for refusing to carry out a clearly risky mission, the critical condition of the submarine, and the incomplete, partially unfamiliar crew, was either ignored or deliberately hidden from investigation. One of the key documents that could shed light on the true state of affairs, the trim log, which Captain Suvorov risked his life to retrieve from the sunken ship while wearing a diving suit, suddenly disappeared. Other technical documents that could have confirmed the version of the submarine's malfunction and the rush to prepare it also disappeared. Meanwhile, the officers and officials who gave the criminal order to launch the submarine were quietly transferred to new positions in other military units and fleets, far from the scene of the events and possible interrogations. This was a kind of cover-up aimed at making sure that all fingers pointed to one person, Captain Suvorov. The court hearings were held over the course of a week, behind closed doors, with no press or public access. As expected, Nikolai Suvorov was the main defendant. He was held fully responsible for the tragedy, despite the fact that he had been acting on orders from his superiors. The leadership, whose signatures were on the training plans, completely disavowed their words and decisions, preferring to protect themselves by making the commander of K-429 the scapegoat. The commander of the 10th Submarine Division, Nikolai Alkiv, stated in court that the submarine was allegedly technically sound, but simply had not been properly prepared for sea due to the inefficiency and negligence of Captain Suvorov and Chief Engineer Lykovozos. According to him, The necessary checks of the hull's watertightness and the functioning of the diving and surfacing systems were not carried out at the base, and the decision to carry them out at sea, under conditions of limited time and an unfamiliar crew, was a serious mistake on the part of the commander. Moreover, he claimed that during the dive, the regulations for issuing commands and monitoring their execution were violated, which is why problems in the operation of the systems remained unnoticed until the moment of the accident. Oleg Arefeev, Chief of Staff of the 2nd Flotilla, who approved the unscheduled exercises, went even further. He accused the commander of allegedly not even giving the order to dive. According to his version, the crew did not know that the boat was submerging and therefore did not close the ventilation shafts, through which a massive influx of seawater began. Simply put, according to Arefeev's version, Suvorov forgot to report that they were sinking. At the trial, Nikolai Suvorov defended himself as best he could. He explained that the submarine was not initially ready to go to sea, that the accident occurred due to malfunctions, some of which could not be detected without routine inspections, which simply had not been carried out. Additional information that emerged after the accident only reinforced doubts about the fairness of the charges brought against K-429 Commander Nikolai Suvorov. For example, Rear Admiral Valery Polivanov, in his documentary book SOS from the Abyss, directly pointed out that the submarine, after leaving the dock for repairs, did not undergo the mandatory leak test. The automatic system erroneously signaled that the ventilation flaps of the fourth compartment were tightly closed, but in fact they were leaky. It was through them that water poured in, instantly flooding the compartment. The water did not come through some random hole, but through the standard pipelines, the very ones that should be reliably isolated during submersion. An alternative, no less alarming version is given by Captain First Rank Nikolai Kuryanchik in his book, The Struggle for Survival, as it is. According to his information, even before the exercises, during their previous service, the crew of K-429 made technical changes to the ventilation system to improve the airflow to the batteries. Such modifications, carried out without the consent of the command and without adjusting the documentation, led to a disruption in the normal operation of the system. Before the training sortie, no one checked the design features and returned them to the factory settings. As a result, this could have been the direct cause of the tragedy. The ventilation remained open, although the automatic system assured the opposite. At the trial, Nikolai Suvorov behaved in a restrained but firm manner. He consistently and insistently claimed that he was faced with the fact of going to sea under threat of a tribunal. He emphasized that in the allotted time, less than a day, it was impossible to complete the crew, carry out the necessary regulatory procedures, and even more so to test all the complex equipment of the submarine. He tirelessly repeated that the submarine's departure in that condition and with such preparation was, from the outset, a gross violation of the combat regulations. The court acknowledged that Suvorov had indeed received orders from the command and that the crew had been assembled from sailors from 5 different submarines, which in itself was a potentially dangerous practice. Moreover, it was noted that the commander had no way of checking the readiness of each of his subordinates. However, the court added that the commander should have taken all circumstances into account and has no right to carry out an order if it threatens the lives of the crew. This formal approach allowed responsibility to be placed on one person, removing it from a system that allowed a combat unit to go to sea without proper inspection and training. As a result, Nikolai Suvorov was found guilty of violating the rules of navigation, resulting in serious consequences, and sentenced to 10 years of corrective labor in a penal colony. Many still consider this sentence to be a flagrant injustice. After all, it was thanks to Suvorov's composure and his clear management of the crew's actions that 104 people were rescued alive from the sunken submarine. Paradoxically, the rescuer ended up in the dock. Senior submarine mechanic Boris Lykovozos also did not escape punishment. He received 7 years in prison, despite repeatedly reporting technical malfunctions in a number of the ship systems and suggesting that the voyage be postponed. Both of those convicted in the K-429 case, Captain First Rank Nikolai Suvorov and Senior Mechanic Boris Lykovozos, ultimately spent less than 3 years behind bars. They were released under an amnesty, but despite the fact that their punishment was formally reduced, the stain of injustice remained on their biographies. After his release, Nikolai Suvorov repeatedly tried to seek justice. He appealed to the courts, the prosecutor's office, and military authorities, and wrote statements to the Supreme Court and the presidential administration, insisting on a review of the case and rehabilitation. But in all cases, he received dry replies. The verdict was lawful and justified, and there were no grounds for its review. It was useless to fight the system. Nikolai Mihailovich passed away in 1998 at the age of 60, never having seen justice done. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when access to previously classified materials became at least partially possible and the atmosphere of total fear weakened, did military experts begin to speak openly about the fact that Captain Suvorov had become a scapegoat, a victim of a heartless hierarchy where subordinates are always to blame for the mistakes of their superiors. One of the first to publicly defend the commander was Rear Admiral Nikolai Mormel. In his book Underwater Disasters, he wrote bluntly, "The loss of K-429 and 16 members of its crew was the result of violence against the commander by his immediate superiors." Suvorov had the Navy's ship regulations on his side, as well as combat training courses, briefings, orders, and common sense. All of these were violated by those who forced him to go to sea. The admiral emphasized that Suvorov received the order to take command of the submarine at a time when most of the regular crew was on leave and physically absent. A motley crew was hastily assembled from 5 other submarines, which was categorically prohibited by regulations. If more than 30% of the crew is replaced, going to sea is prohibited. In addition, the investigation documented that the boat had technical malfunctions, including problems with ventilation, water tightness, and instruments. Under these circumstances, the responsibility for making the decision should have rested with the division headquarters and the relevant technical services of the fleet, which were obliged to prohibit the submarine from going to sea. As for the further fate of the K-429 submarine, it turned out to be no less tragic than its combat history. After the 1983 accident, it was decided to raise the submarine from the bottom of Saranaya Bay. The salvage operation took a month and a half and cost the state an astronomical sum for those times, over 300 million rubles. The hope was that the expensive repairs would allow the boat to be returned to service. However, just 2 years later, in 1985, K-429 sank again, this time right next to the factory wall in the waters of the ship repair yard. The cause was gross violations in the repair process and technical miscalculations. Fortunately, this time there were no casualties. After the second sinking, no one attempted to raise the boat, it was simply left to sink into oblivion. From that moment on, the fate of the submarine became a symbol of missed opportunities and tragedies that could have been avoided. K-429 was removed from the fleet's combat composition, reclassified as a training vessel, and in 1990 was finally decommissioned and sent for scrapping. Its hull was dismantled for scrap metal, and its history was reduced to myths, speculation, and controversy. Meanwhile, the memory of those who died lives on. In the village of Rybaki in Kamchatka, where the Pacific Fleet was based, a memorial has been erected in honor of the lost submariners. 16 names are engraved on one of the stone blocks, the names of the crew members of K-429 who died on June 24, 1983. For relatives and loved ones, this place has become a symbol not only of tragedy, but also of injustice that has never been rectified. After the death of Commander Nikolai Suvorov, his widow, Zinaida Vasilievna, continued to fight for the restoration of her husband's good name. She wrote appeals to the Chief Military Prosecutor's Office, demanded a review of the case, and asked sharp, logical, and still unanswered questions. Why was no one held accountable for authorizing a technically faulty and understaffed ship to go to sea? Why did the court focus only on the actions of Suvorov and Likhavozo, ignoring the orders of their superiors? Why were the actions of the command, which insisted on the exercises at any cost, not investigated? Zinaida Vasilievna received form letters and standard responses to all these questions. The verdict remained in force, despite the fact that decades later, most military experts agree that Nikolai Suvorov was a victim of circumstances and the bureaucratic system, not the cause of the disaster. To this day, disputes about K-429 continue. Some continue to argue that the commander was obliged to refuse to leave, even under threat of court-martial. Others are convinced that the tragedy was organized and allowed to happen by senior military officials, such as Division Commander Nikolai Alkiv and Chief of Staff Oleg Arefiev. There is a third point of view, much less personalized but no less compelling. Time itself was to blame for the demise of K-429. It was an era when carrying out orders at any cost, without considering the consequences and without the right to object, was an integral part of military and state culture. The tragedy of K-429 reflected an entire era, a time when human life was often less valuable than political ambitions, ostentatious exercises, and fear of higher authorities. A time that itself became one of the invisible but most dangerous enemies of the crew.